Okay, good morning, everybody. And let me echo the words of Marco and Andrea and also welcome you here. The room is filled to capacity, and this is wonderful. This shows how important this conference is and how important I think the endeavor that we're set out to undertake here is. And I hope we will get towards the next step of this endeavor. My presentation is going to be sort of like a back to basics, just to ground all of us. Why are we here? What is this ELRC and the current undertakings with respect to machine translation? What are they all about? This is why we're here. This is a picture that shows the distribution of languages in tweets in 2008 or 2012 or something like that. Now, in Europe, we have 24 official languages, and with the CEF-affiliated countries, there's 26 languages, maybe even more. If you count all the other dialects or other big languages that are not yet official languages, then in Europe, we're talking about 60, 80 languages. And languages are really important for us. You know, they define us maybe even as human beings. They're part of our culture, of our background, of our heritage, etc. And of course, they're supported by the EC for those very, very reasons. But as in many, many cases, the situation is complex. The EC has to balance things because languages can also result in barriers to communication, exchange and flow of ideas, commerce, etc. So what we have to do in the EU is we have to support our languages, our culture, our identities, but we also have to make sure that these languages do not turn into barriers or gaps that cannot be surmounted. So how do we bridge these language gaps, these barriers? How do we make sure that information does not stay in silos and is inaccessible because people just don't happen to speak the right language, or not all of the 24 languages or 26 languages, official languages in Europe? How do we make sure that nobody is discriminated against because of their language? How do we treat all the languages the same? Of course, the answer is translation. And translation has two important aspects. There's human translation, and of course there's technology-supported translation. This is quite old. More recently, over the last 10 years, of course, machine translation has made big inroads in human translation, in partnership with human translation. It's used by human translation in workflows, etc. And the reason for that technology support, is that there's simply so much that needs to be translated. The volume and the velocity of what we have to do is so big that even if we doubled, tripled, quadrupled the number of human translators in the EC, we would not be able to cope with this. And many of you here are language professionals. You remember that we had a similar situation about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when translation memories, the first sort of like translation technology support that was introduced in the translation, professional translation, happened because of this great demand of translation, because of multinational commerce and the continuing multinationality of industries and so on. But at the same time, you all know that human languages are incredibly complex. And I'll give you just one example because we're running out of time here. One word may mean many, many different things, and one meaning in the other direction can be expressed by many, many different words. So what you have between the words and the meanings, between the forms and the functions, you have many-to-many relationships. And that makes it very, very hard for machines to process human languages. We have metaphor, we have literal language, meaning is context dependent. You all know this, I don't have to tell you about this. And that means that maybe human languages are so complex that we cannot exactly describe them in a big formula. And we tried that for many, many years. This is kind of like rule-based language technologies. We tried to come up with big formulas that describe human languages, kind of like, you know, there's a big formula that takes a sentence and its context of utterance and gives a really good translation. Yeah? Probably human languages are too complex to do that. So what do? In such situations where we have data available to us, we use the best of our machine learning technologies to do something with this complex phenomenon, human language, that we cannot sort of like just cover with a very, very complex formula, that we cannot describe exactly in all of its complexity and entirely. And machine learning relies, of course, on data. Machine learning, the word learning is one of the two key words there, as machines are trying to learn to do something from data. They're trying to find patterns in data that help the machines to do something. And machine translation is no different. statistical machine translation, more recently, last 2 years, neural machine translation. Many of you will have heard about neural machine translation, the new generation of machine translation, and it's very likely to be much better than the old machine learning-based version. They all rely on machine learning. And machine learning is nothing without data. Now, in the case of human translation, the data that our machines learn from is, of course, human translations. Now, these are translations that have been done by human experts, by professional translators. So data is the key, data is the core. The data that machine translation works on is called bytext, human translation. It's documents, text in a source language with their corresponding translation in the target language. Right? Now, here's an example of bytext. Here you see 2 Harry Potter books. One is in English, and then I think the other one is in Czech. I'm not quite sure. That's an example of training data for a machine translation project. So if you train a statistical or neural machine translation system on Harry Potter, and you give it weather reports to translate, the system will not be very good, simply because it hasn't really learned in its training data about weather reports. Yeah? If, however, you give it magic spells to translate, then the output is likely to be very, very good, because you've had the right data to translate your new job. Okay? And that's exactly the situation that we're facing at the moment with CEF and with the EU. Yeah? We have a lot of data, a lot of very, very good data, but we don't have the right kind of data that we need to train our machine translation systems on to do the new jobs over and above the old jobs that we want to do with machine translation. And the new jobs are providing translation facilities, machine translation facilities for the national public services and for their needs and their demands. That's the new bit. Okay. So let's get there. So translation is everywhere. I think that's very, very true to say. Industry, culture, travel, governance, education, management. And of course, the EC is no stranger to translation. In fact, it's a prime producer and consumer in translation. It's likely to be the largest translation organization, or runs the largest translation organization in the world. So they're really, really experts. And of course, they have been using machine translation for a long, long time. In fact, they've been using the Moses statistical machine translation software that was developed with funding, research funding that Marco mentioned earlier on by the EU. And that's kind of like the current state of the art, statistical machine translation. Now, what is new? Okay. The EC has decided to go beyond its comfort zone, so to speak. Right? The EC is using machine translation a lot for their in-house demands. Translation of parliamentary debates in the EC, translation of legal texts, for example, and the EC has really, really good training data for that. But now it wants to go beyond that. It wants to provide translation facility, automatic translation support for the needs and demands of the local national public services, and also NGOs, and of course also the DSIs, the digital service infrastructures that come with CEF. And the areas that are of interest here are consumer rights, health, really important, public procurement, social security, culture, justice. The online services include the DSIs, the Open Data Portal, Europeana, online dispute resolution, e-justice, etc. Now let's get back to Harry Potter and having the right kind of training data for these very sophisticated machine learning-based machine translation systems, be they statistical or neural machine translation systems. I already mentioned that the EC has very, very good data for their own in-house needs. But it doesn't have the right kind of data to serve the needs of you, the national public services. And this is a bit like the training on Harry Potter example and then translating weather reports. It doesn't fit. The machine translation system is like a good professional human translator. A human translator specializes. So one human translator might specialize on the automotive domain. That human translator is trained on this domain, has seen a lot of automotive texts. And he or she is likely not to be as good in the legal domain because they simply haven't had that experience. And the same for these machine learning-based systems. The experience they have comes through the training data, and it has to be the right kind of training data for the right job. Okay. Now the question is, who has the right kind of training data for the needs and for the demands of the national public services? Of course, that is the national public services, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're working together and working with you to get that data and to make that available to everybody, to share that data with the EC, but also with each other. That's why we're here. So the ELRC Consortium, it's kind of like, led by DFKI, and our partners are ELRA, ELDA, TILDA, ILSP, but very, very importantly, it's not just sort of like, I don't know, a consortium. It's a consortium that is grounded and that is rooted through national anchor points in the EC, the EU member states, at the local level. There's local ownership, local participation. And these national anchor points come in two categories, if you like. One pair, one person of the pair, they are technology anchor points. They are people of exceptional standing and repute in their local countries, with reach to the local ministries, etc. But they come from the language technology domain, from the language technology area. And their partners are, again, people of exceptional national repute and standing that come from the public services in those countries. And this pair together help us to reach into the member states and to talk to the right people and to get the right data. Our first mission was to run 30 workshops to create awareness that data is so important, that data is actually held, variable data is actually held in the various EU countries, and how can we best make them accessible. We're almost through with these workshops. There's, I think, 1 or 2 left. Here's a graphical representation. You see a map of Europe where some of the workshops took place and our national anchor points are based. The goals of these workshops were to raise awareness about the importance of data, to understand the needs of the national public services and the administration for which we want to provide services, and to jointly, and the stress here is really on jointly, identify the relevant resources of multilingual training data for machine translation. And then to discuss and set in train a process of providing and sharing these resources with the EC so that the EC under CEF at AT can train machine translation systems that directly speak to the needs of the national public services and the various DSIs under CEF. This is the website. And the most important bit here is the yellow bit that you see here, and that's contribute resources. We're now in the last sort of like half year of the ELRC, so ELRC has been running about 1.5 years, and so far the contribution has been tremendous and stunning, I would say even. We have more than 120 resources from across Europe here, and we go into much, much more detail in that a bit later on. Here you just see a snapshot. And these resources are substantial, high quality, and really, really good. And that's just the beginning, because remember that nothing like this has ever been attempted. Right? It's quite amazing. So this is kind of like, the topic of the conference is contribute and share your data for a better Europe, and I really believe in that. I think we can, to a small extent, contribute to make Europe actually better and more easy for its citizens. I think this is well possible. And we provide a lot of support for this. I won't go into details, help desks, legal advice, technical advice, etc. But we'll go into that in the presentation. So contribute and share your data for a better Europe. Let me just sort of like very briefly step through today's agenda to give you an indication how the agenda of today sort of like pans out and is designed to support this endeavor, this sharing data. So after the introductions, we have an overview, an automated translation at CEF. This is given by Alexandra. This provides extremely important background information. And then we go into a session where we actually hear from the language professionals that are working with machine translation. How can they benefit from this? And we have a presentation by Katja May from DGT and by Jaroslav Garachenko from company GetIT Language Solutions. Then after the coffee break, we will see some cutting-edge research. Machine translation is not just about text, it is also about spoken language, and we have Professor Alex Weibel here from KIT Karlsruhe give us a demonstration on live spoken translation. And then again, we go towards a sort of like more industry business-oriented perspective. We have Markus Danay here from SAP. And Markus sort of like really concentrates on that theme that you need the right data for the right kind of translations to get the optimal results, which is why we're here and what we're trying to achieve here today. And then, of course, many of you are interested in the legal dimension of sharing data. Can we just share data? Can we just give? It's not really giving away. It's really about sharing. You keep your data, but you're sharing it with somebody else. We have a presentation on the legal dimension of this by Prodomos Tsiavios on this. And then after this, we're going to have an overview, this is after lunch, on what has been collected so far, just to give you an idea, and also an idea of the momentum that is building up at the moment in this, which is amazing. We're getting so many contributions and so much enthusiasm and support for this from across Europe. And 2 countries in particular, but these are just exemplary. We could have taken other countries. Ireland and Germany will report from the ground on some of the activities and how they're organizing this locally. So these are 2 presentations by Aidan McCormack and by Alexandra Soska. And then following that, in the early afternoon, we'll have a panel. And in this panel, we really want to engage you. So the idea here is that I'm just going to ask the panelists to sort of like maybe articulate 1 or 2 things that they think are really crucial for sharing data in Europe and for ELRC. And we'll just use that as a starting point to get you engaged with the panel of experts and ask your questions. And hopefully we can provide as many answers as possible. And then finally, we have an outlook on some of the digital services infrastructures that will benefit directly from the machine translation systems and the data that we're trying to gather and the MT systems that our colleagues at the EC are producing. And then finally, at the end of the day, there's a short summary and conclusions, and there's only one man that stands between you and the champagne reception. That's me, and I promise to keep that brief because we're late already. So thank you very much. I hope you will enjoy the conference. I hope we will be able to engage and voice your concerns and what data you have, how you can engage and contribute. We're very much looking forward to the conference. Thank you very much.